Good afternoon, and welcome to today's Exeter Institutogram conversation with me, Sajjad Rizvi, from the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies at the University of Exeter. We've now done 10 of these, and it's been wonderfully interesting for myself, and I hope it's been interesting for those of you who've been watching this as well. Today, we're going to be in conversation with Carool Kersten, who is a reader in the study of Islam and the modern world, and at King's College London, and he's a leading expert on contemporary Islamic thought. So now I need to patch Carool in. Oh, I hope he's not gone to... Yeah, there he is. So just waiting for Carool to reply, and then we can start our conversation. Hi, Carool.
Hi, how are you?
Good, thanks. How are you?
I'm fine.
Cool. So that worked fairly smoothly.
That was all right, yeah.
Yeah, it usually does. It usually does. I mean, there's always a few glitches as you expect, but it's been fairly smooth. And as I mentioned, I've done about 10 of these, so I've learned some of the tricks of what to do over the time. So the title, of course, you gave me and which we advertised was New Avenues, New Approaches to the Study of Islamic Thought, Contemporary Islamic Thought. And so before, I guess, we get to your proposals and what you've been working on, I thought it might be useful for us to begin by reflecting on how people have tended to study contemporary Islamic thought in the academy and perhaps even, more widely, because the question of what constitutes Islamic thought is of interest to people beyond the academy as well.
Mm-hmm.
So how do people study contemporary Islamic thought? Is it useful to even consider that as a category, as a subject of inquiry in itself?
Well, I've always opted the word thought rather than, say, defining it as a discipline like philosophy or theology or whatever. It gives you a bit of a wider license. So, well, the approaches that people take are probably very comparable to the study of whether it's philosophy or theology or other intellectual history as itself, or the history of ideas. I think the way people have approached the Muslim world, or what Muslims think, does not differ all that much maybe from people specializing in other cultures, civilizations, or geographical areas. No vast differences there. One of the challenges which is becoming increasingly so is, of course, linguistic aptitude.
Yes.
Which is where I see that also universities tend to move towards ever more generic programs and especially in English-speaking countries, the expectations of knowing another language than English is not even there.
Yes.
So in that sense, I see the field changing. That is not necessarily disastrous. I mean, a lot of people have also remained locked up, especially I think when it has anything to do with the study of Islam, in that philological approach that
Right. Yeah.
the Germans and the French so excelled in. And there is maybe a bit more in terms of methodology or approach, or even also the interest in regards to what sets of ideas you want to explore, of becoming a little bit more adventurous.
Sure.
I mean, in that sense, it's becoming maybe less predictable, and for that reason, a bit more interesting.
No, I mean, that's true. And I think for me, what's quite interesting in ways we can look at the contemporary world is perhaps move away from the traditional kind of focus on Arabic, right? So
Yes, I think that is a very important. I mean, it's usually Arabic, with probably Persian being a good second.
Yes.
Especially in a domain of ideas, philosophical, theological, or otherwise, Sufism, obviously. But then, indeed, the other language groups. I mean, Turkish probably doesn't fare too badly, and South Asia, certainly not at British universities.
Yeah.
But anything further afield and more exotic, think, Sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, often, falls a bit by the wayside.
Yeah. And of course, you've done that yourself because you've worked on Southeast Asia as well as on the Middle East. So,
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the reason I came to the UK is that already for my PhD research, I wanted to look at. I mean, the choices were sort of random. It was people who were sort of appealed to me or fancied the ideas they were developing. But I ended up indeed with an Egyptian and a French Algerian thinker and somebody from Indonesia. And I thought already, the only place where you can do that is probably in SOAS. And even there, it was a bit of an exercise because the scholars there also tend to be locked up in their geographical silos.
Yeah. I mean,
so if you take a more of a thematic approach, you can straddle these fields, but very often that is how many languages can a person learn to begin with? But I've indeed ended up after that PhD project where I wandered indeed between Europe, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia. The next 10 years I spent mostly on Indonesia, and it was interesting, but it was partly also that I felt it was an area that was underamplified, and for quite a while, interesting things were happening. It has a sort of, unfortunately, become a bit more impoverished as things polarized in Indonesia.
Right.
And people who were, had a degree of license after the regime change of exploring areas where you thought, are Muslims even thinking about these type of things? Indonesia was one of these countries where that was possible, but that has a sort of, become less open and much more constricted from the mid-2000s onwards. And I see now some glimpses of that. The balance is tilting a bit to the other way, but I've also a limited concentration span. So after almost 10 years of doing Indonesian stuff and writing 2 books about that, I'm now again, exploring ways of not being confined geographically. Also, I think an increasing importance, and this might help also people working at higher education institutes in say, Europe, there is a growing contribution and also an audience for ideas developed by Muslims living, working, growing up in Europe and in North America, and then also writing automatically in European languages, while they often do have the command, of course, of what we all expect of a scholar.
Yes,
to have under his or her belt.
I mean, around a decade ago, I had a student who wrote a very interesting dissertation comparing Tariq Ramadan with Sayyid Hussein Nasr, right? And when he did
these
that,
kind of things,
and I mean, more recently, there a lot more on kind of European Islam or European Islamic thought, etc., which are coming out. So I think that's definitely the case. I haven't seen much which is kind of thought focused so much on in the US. I think in North America, there's been a lot about Muslim culture. And practice and so forth, but a lot less, I think, on the actual kind of thought element of it.
Except for Fazl Rahman, maybe, but is he American or Pakistani? Probably the jury is even out on that.
There are a few, of course, there are a few studies of Fazl Rahman, but there's not that much on North America.
No, but it might get some traction. I mean, people like Khaled Abul Fadl have done interesting things. Ibrahim Musa is recognized as call it an authoritative voice on all kinds of things, and he's also belligerent enough to keep it interesting.
Sure. Well, of course, that's important.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, these things are I mean, they're alive. They're evolving and developing. But aside from indeed looking at, say, maybe different interlocutors and also look beyond the, say, historical, geographical world of Islam, I think also it is interesting to maybe dare and explore beyond various academic disciplines where the history of ideas could feature, whether it is philosophy, theology, history departments, or religion departments, where they might look at say, you know,
Yeah. No, no, I
things
think
like mysticism that basically touches on all three or four. Well, and I have to sort of start to re-educate myself there as well. I've thought, what about literary writings or people who do literary writings and say more essayist or even proper academic work? I mean, I find that an interesting development. I mean, the figures like, you know, the ones I've worked on, whether it's Hassan Hanafi or Mohammed Arkoun, Nasser Abu Zaid, I mean, they all have their lifelong projects and they build these massive edifices of you know, solid, either systematic philosophical work or historical oriented approaches like Arkoun and Abu Zaid. I think there is certain individuals around, and some of them are no longer around, who have a sort of a sound academic background, but also had this proclivity of doing fictional writings or something in between, and I find that interesting. So that is I'm identifying people for my future projects who take that approach also to, you know, in the remaining years of my career to read not only learned books but also ones that are sort of fun to read.
Yeah, well, I think that's it's interesting because of course you know, the influence of philosophy, of theology, of mysticism on literature is, you know, very much a feature of the Muslim world, and it always has been. So one would be surprised if it was absent in the contemporary anyway. So I think something like that would be really
but probably very often, you know, if say an academic decides to write also a literary book, even if it's, you know, just really a novel type of thing, and it looks almost like balladry or whatever. It's maybe often a sort of dismissed as a hobby, you know, and no, let's read their solid academic work, and the rest is spielerij. But I think that is maybe a bit too easy. So I think I found a few people already which I can include in what I want to do in the next couple of years. And again, I'm also looking beyond the English-speaking world. I mean, there is a literature of, you know, where religion as a theme features abundantly. People from South Asian extraction, which of course, that's literature that is quite well known in many English-speaking countries. But well, being the troublemaker I am, and from a small country, I also want to include, you know, German writing and even French-speaking authors. Although my, you know, French takes me also quite some effort to read, and occasionally some of these books even get translated into English, and then I take the easy way out as well. But yeah, I've identified a few where I think, well, their profiles are sort of comparable, so it's not also comparing apples and pears per se, but think from Germany, an individual like Navid Kirmani, whose, you know, academic credentials are established as well. I mean, his book on aesthetics of the Quran and on the Theodicy, that's solid German stuff. But already he wedges in, you know, comparisons with German writers whom he just happens to like, you know, and you think, well, are they really relevant for that research? But, you know, well,
his collected essays are wonderfully interesting.
The one between Quran and Kafka. I love that. I mean, that is such, it's entertaining, informative, and thought-provoking at the same time, in my view.
I mean, it's also interesting because, of course, he's kind of, I guess, like a full-time writer. And
that's how he also, you know, establishes and presents himself. I mean, he has the academic credentials, but he has thought not to pursue an academic career and become a bread writer. I mean, he has also all these you know, playwright interests. And I mean, the funniest thing I found is he even resists writing in English. because he says it might negatively affect his German. And, even, native speakers of German have told me that, there is very few German writers who write the kind of elegant prose Navid Kermani writes. I mean, he's of Iranian extraction, but he's a born German. He is German who just happens to have Iranian parents. It's almost like that.
Yeah, no, I think someone like Kermani is very interesting, quite simply because he's trying to make different kinds of interventions, and they're not always interventions, of a Muslim, say, or within a Muslim.
No, not at all.
They're
And I
also
think
trying
that
to
is,
place that within a wider context. Yeah.
and this is something that also informs my project, because partly I think also moving to literary writings could help, and I think it's much needed, is that you automatically have to confront the identity question. And in particular, when you look at Europe and against the background of a refugee/migrant crisis, these are not the same things, although they often they get conflated as well. But it's always collective identities, even by the self-appointed spokespeoples of these communities. It's all the looking for that common denominator. Literary writings often give you an opportunity to showcase the individual. And I think a person like Kermani has found a way around that also to tie these things together. I mean, the very standing he has in Germany was already affirmed a few years ago when, on the, I think it was the 50th anniversary of the establishment of the Bundestag, Parliament, he was invited to give the keynote speech.
Yeah.
And he's, I mean, the very fact that this was, of course, a conscious decision to take a child of migrants and let him speak about that. But he made a point in it. He said these identity questions are important, but they should also lead us to recognize citizenship. He coined a word for it, Verfassungspatriotismus, confession, constitutional patriotism. Nothing to do with a folk, a people, or a territory, but belonging as a citizen. So there is a very strong political agenda there, and a confession of values and ethics rather than a religious tradition. And he explores that very much through literary writings, even indeed these collections of essays, which kind of sort of they are vignettes, but they're often more captivating and evocative than philosophical abstractions. That's why the working title for my project also is moving from abstraction to sublimation, which is something you can do in literary writings, and it's probably even more confusing than doing the abstract. Yeah. But that concreteness teaches you something too.
Yeah. So I mean, certainly that kind of juxtaposition is interesting because. It just because of this kind of current obsession that people have with identity and this kind of is the very essence of Europe, and which has always struck me, perhaps because I am a child of migrants and I've never felt that I needed to identify myself very strongly in one way or the other. This whole notion of Europe, especially within the Brexit context that we find ourselves in Britain, it seems to be really almost kind of denying basic experiences and what people are and who what they do, and so certainly if academics can do something, it's certainly to kind of hold up a mirror to people and say, well, look, this is actually what's going on. It's not perceptions of what you might be imagining that is actually going on in terms of the change of Europe, but this is a snapshot of what is out there.
Yeah, and it's definitely not only the Brexit experience in the UK, but it's also the rise of all types of often very unsavory populist types in many other European, and basically they're two sides of the same coin. They all play identity politics, but they're very flat identities, or you know, a single theme.
Yeah,
I
it's
mean,
not clear.
throughout Europe, we have seen this phenomenon that, you know, well, especially on the mainland, a lot of the migrant communities, now second and even third generation, were, of course, the children of foreign workers. And they started out as guest workers, and after a few decades, they were turned into either, you know, allochthonous Dutch people or Dutch from Turkish backgrounds.
Yeah,
And then come 9/11, suddenly those very same people became the gloss category Muslim.
yeah, of course. Yeah,
The same people, you
yeah,
know, and and it works both ways. They sort of start identifying like that, and they're being identified like that. And I think literature and a lot of the literary writers who sort of agitate or respond to these things, they provide sort of counter narratives, which then can open up windows like what Kermani did in regards to, yeah, well, you can even be patriotic, but it is about, you know, your constitutional rights and not having been, you know, of German extraction for the last
yeah. Blood.
2000
Not about
years,
blood.
which,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. I mean, nationalism, it's, you know, it starts with folk dance, it ends with barbed wire, as I always say.
Okay, so maybe we should talk about what your project is a bit more. So what
Yeah,
is
well, I'm a sort of organizing it under that header from abstraction to sublimation, and I'm at the moment I'm just a sort of again a kind of randomly selecting writers who sort of appeal to me. Navid Kermani is one of them. Another one is the late Abdul Wahab Wedeb, Tunisian of origin, but he spent his whole working life um, in France. But he too, from a sort of an avant-gardist, left-leaning poet in you know 60s Paris, he started writing more and more about also his background. You know, as you know, Medeb is just a sort of a Gallicized version of Muaddab. He's from a
right?
family of ulama
Yeah,
from Kairouan.
right. Yeah,
And both he and, I mean, Kermani doesn't use that term explicitly, but you know, the very fact that he writes these books where he juxtaposes writers from the German canon with texts from the Islamic canon in that book between Quran and Kafka.
yeah,
Medeb does something similar, but he sort of identifies also. He speaks, you know, unapologetically about his double genealogy. I think he even coined his PhD thesis like that, which had to do with how literary writings exactly allowed you to exhibit your double genealogy. And he has these books, you know, Occidental Exile, and he has that same, you know, he's at home in two literatures, the Francophone literature, and he is smitten with certain Sufi poets. I mean, he has done translations of Shatahad of Al-Bistami and people like that. And he became increasingly more engaged as well and writing more essayist type of things. So the oeuvres of both Kermani and Medeb are one
right.
component of it. Another one I insist on including is somebody who has remained in the Muslim world, a Moroccan philosopher, Ben Salem Hanish,
Right.
who is, you know, he's a professional philosopher, an academic philosopher of, you know, the ilk of Al-Jabri, the people I used to work on.
Right.
And he even served as a minister of culture, so he has some political traction as well. But he wrote three fictionalized biographies of, well, a sort of idiosyncratic people from the Islamic tradition. He did one on Ibn Sab'in,
Right.
which was a sort of relatively innocently entitled Hadha al-Andalusi in Arabic, but in English it's published as a Muslim suicide. I don't think you would get
I
it.
saw that. Yeah, I saw that.
I think you wouldn't get away with that in an Arabic context. Well, it is that alleged story that he committed suicide in Mecca during Tawaf. I mean, that's the story. And he sort of leaves it out there. But, you know, it is basically following Ibn Sab'in from Murcia all the way on his Hajj to Mecca, and what exactly happened there. He leaves it in the middle. And the other one is on Al-Hakim, the sort of semi-crazed Fatimid Caliph, and one on Ibn Khaldun. And on Ibn Khaldun, he has written also 2 academic books. So I find it interesting that somebody invests his time and effort in writing these kind of books, and the selection of the very individuals he picked. I mean, that's not a coincidence. There's something there I want to delve into deeper.
No, that sounds quite interesting. But are you thinking of going beyond, I guess, novels or memoirs? I mean, like, what about film? Film.
No, I haven't looked at that yet. No, I leave that to the aficionados. I know there is people like Jonas Otterbeck, who has recently joined Aga Khan University. He's a musician himself and has been doing this for decades. So, and Mark Levine as well. I mean, I'll leave that to the music. I'm tone deaf, so there's no point for me to go into music. Film, well, I might touch on it a bit, because another approach I'm interested in, and which I got a sort of sidetracked when I was doing my survey into what kind of literary writers are interesting, and I came across this. Well, it still is one of the weirdest books I've ever read, and for a long time I couldn't shed the feeling like I was, whether was it not a story of the new clothes of the emperor. Right. I read Cyclonopedia by Reza Negarestani, which is presented as, it was the first time I heard of the term, theory fiction. It's not science fiction, but it is doing weird stuff basically with existing philosophical systems, and really pushing the limits. And he's often identified, and most of these people resist that identification with the speculative realists, Graham Harman, Ray Brassier, Meillassoux, these kind of people. I mean, he works with them, but most of these people don't like that designation, speculative realists. Right. But Cyclonopedia, it's a bit like the Arabian Nights or the Decameron. It's a frame story, and of course a manuscript is found of a crazed Persian engineer. Sometimes you think you're reading conspiracy theories, and it was one of the blurbs on the back which came from, I think it was indeed Graham Harman. He said reading Cyclonopedia is like being converted to Islam by Salvador Dali. Well, then you've got my interest already.
Well, yeah, that's a good way of selling the book.
Yeah. It's the same that Navid Kermani said, I learned more about Muhammad from Minima Moralia than from the Quran. I mean, if you want to upset Muslims, say something like that. But at least you get the attention.
But I think it's also very realistic, because the world in which we live, there's so many different kinds of influences upon us. So yes, of course the pious person might say, yes, the primary influence on me is the Quran, but the honest person will say, no, it's also maybe it's Taylor Swift, maybe it's kind of I don't know, the 50 Cents, maybe it's, all sorts of, maybe it's what
but it's what Navid Kermani calls the piety, the heresy of the pious.
Yeah.
He has this wonderful line, it's only those who worship the Most High who are capable of throwing stones into heaven.
Yeah, yeah.
That's a beautiful line.
Yeah, it's only the friends of God who are true heretics. Yeah.
Yes, and that is why he chose Job and Attar as his figures for the theodicy debate.
I absolutely love that book. In fact, I've just written an article about that.
Okay. Yeah.
I've written a piece on Job, which basically uses that. Yeah.
But here and there in these chapters, he already wedges in figures like Jean-Paul and his favorite poet Hölderlin, which you would think, but you're writing a scholar. This is your habilitation. What are you doing? But basically, you get a preview of the book we talked about. The essay collection.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, that I think that kind of intellectual adventurism, I think it's legitimate because these people have established their academic credentials, have also demonstrated they are solid creative writers, and this is something I want to explore, and then even weird off spins like Cyclonopedia by a lot of people first thought Reza Negarestani didn't exist. And he wrote the book when he was still in Iran and couldn't get out. And people thought it's just a pen name for one of these, either for Brassier or for Harman. But the man is genuine. He's alive and he got away from Iran and is now in the States and starting to write also sort of, more academically recognizable philosophical books. But Cyclonopedia it got a bit of cult status, I think, even among these people. But yeah, he does refer also to, say, horror movies in that book. And I've nothing with science fiction and fantasy and the horror films. Lovecraft, they all seem to be fans of Lovecraft. I was always very dismissive of that. Right. But maybe I was wrong.
Possibly.
So it is definitely not quite certain. I was probably wrong. So I'm using him because by coincidence I got dragged into a project at the Institute of Philosophical Studies in Slovenia, with which I have already an established connection for a while, and they were doing something on post-humanism and the effects it would have on things like artificial intelligence and what does creation theology do with that. So I thought, okay, the stuff they talk about in Cyclonopedia and speculative realism, it's basically one big attack on post-Kantian philosophy and what they call philosophies of access. They say, why confine it to the human brain to begin with? They say, look at where we're moving. Philosophy will have to think about that. And then if a person like Negarestani is capable of employing and probably creatively misreading tropes he takes from the Islamic tradition.
But I think a lot of people. I was in a workshop a while ago where we were talking about what might be the implications of post-humanism for theologies, and it's
going to be huge.
It's going to be massive because in a lot, especially in the Abrahamic faiths, because the definition of the human is so central to the image of the divine, and so if the image of the divine,
and a guy like Negarestani is pushing the limits there. I mean, he does things with notions like, he's Iranian, so he's presumably Shia, and indeed he talks about the notion of taqiyya, but he does something entirely different with it, and how he regards the apocalypse. I mean, he really makes you think. It may be, flattened by theologians. I don't know that. I mean, there I'm lucky that I'm a sort of self-proclaimed historian of ideas, and the only thing I do is say, isn't this interesting? And then I let more intelligent people like you tell me whether it's solid or not.
I think it is. The thing is, what you often find is, and historians are very useful for this, is that things are perhaps not as fixed as we perhaps thought that they were.
Yeah.
And so theological positions, of course, we know they develop over time, but also sometimes the way in which people conceive of something now may not be the way. Yeah. And actually paying attention to the literary, for example, when you look at early hadith, right? So especially, for example, in the Shia tradition, there's so many hadith where they have a certain literary quality. So the question is, how are we supposed to take this? Is this to be taken literally? Is this a particular kind of story? Is this an imagination of something? I mean, there's so much more going on there than just, the idea of a verbatim scripture of some sort, or the pronouncement, which is different. So, I mean, certainly the literary study of those sorts of texts are extremely useful and interesting.
Yeah, I think indeed backtracking it historically within a tradition, like what you said, that even hadith have this. Well, look at the writings of most of the Sufis. I mean, that is also not systemic in that sense, but these are very profound ideas, and we have it in the Western tradition as well. There is indeed those massive edifices set up by people like Kant and Hegel. But there is also Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, and they're recognized as legitimate philosophers. So I think literary writers might also maybe should be taken more serious also by scholars of religion or historians of ideas. Often I don't know exactly what I am, but there is something in it for us.
Yeah. But I think it's this whole idea of kind of being a bit transgressive with one's understanding of literature. And, as I said, coming back again to the example of hadith, there is, there is a lot of humor which people forget. I would argue there's even humor in the Quran. I know there have been studies of humor in the Bible.
Well, there is, I mean, if there's one thing we fall short on as scholars of religion is a sense of humor, unfortunately. Exactly. We take ourselves way too serious.
And I think, because we consider when we're studying traditions and, figures that are held to be sacred figures for believers, but that doesn't mean that those figures didn't know how to have a laugh.
Right? Exactly. So, exactly.
There's a lot of that sort of material. There's even things which we might consider to be obscene, from a Victorian perspective.
But that too.
It's also very much part of what these are accounts, these are stories which are human stories. Right?
Yes.
And so those are very important elements of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's why I think indeed it is legitimate to. I mean, basically, I would almost dare to say that all these little vignettes you can present of more essayist writings by people, or indeed really stories, made up, fictionalized stories. Why not? If you take aphorisms seriously, then these things could be as well.
Yeah. I mean, I think also what you're suggesting breaks down some of the. It seems to me, in terms of the contemporary study of thought, there's a very sharp division between those who do, I guess, what you might call Islamic thought,
right,
and those who do, for want of a better word, secular thought in the Muslim milieu. Right?
Yes, I would probably be on that side of the equation. Yeah.
The thing is, I don't think the two groups read each other's work. And it was very clear to me.
That is probably very true, yes.
I've recently been quite interested in, I'm trying to put a project together which is on the reception of certain philosophers, mainly Heidegger, Bergson, Kierkegaard. And of course, the reception works in different ways. It works amongst people who are very traditionally trained ulama, and it works amongst people who are like Sorbonne educated or German educated philosophers, etc. But they were clearly reading each other's works, but those of us who work on them are not reading each other's work. So I started.
Maybe that's the curse of specialization.
Of course, yeah. So I was looking at some of these recent works which have come out on existentialism in the Arab world, or the new Arab left and things like that, or works on contemporary Arabic thought, and that whole field and the reference are so very different from the people who've been writing about Islamic thought post 67 or post 79, and yet the intellectual kind of markers and references in many ways are very similar. They're all reading the same things. They're all kind of responding to your Kants and your Heideggers and your Ibn Arabis and your Ibn Sinas and all of this stuff at the same time. And it would definitely be useful for us to be a bit more joined up, a bit more connected.
Yes.
In the intellectual.
No, I think we will have to recognize that research projects also. I mean, we are of course humanities people, and we love to stare at text, which is a solitary business. But indeed, more and more of this will have to come out of a sort of teamwork, and we'll all continue to ride our own hobby horses, which is fine. But I mean, there is some validity to although it never got the traction he had hoped for. So what Muhammad Arkoun said with his applied Islamology, this almost agenda of 16 themes that needed to be addressed, and he said, it's not for one person. This is for teams of scholars of Muslim and non-Muslim backgrounds, and of a whole array of academic specialisms from the humanities and the social sciences. That is going to be quite an effort because, you know, we do remain locked up in silos. And the specialization we also face in our field. I mean, we can't be like Goldseer anymore.
But, you know, I think it's also the fact that, you know, I'm sure you feel it, and we do as well, that you're being pushed increasingly to make those sorts of partnerships. And,
yes,
you know, the whole point
which
of
I see as a
like
positive, yeah.
Yeah, but also the whole point of something like the ERC as a funding body is really about trying to encourage people to think big.
Yes. Yes, indeed. Yeah.
Even within the British context, I think because we know you can't get money to just edit your favorite 13th century text anymore.
No. Although there should be money for that as well. You know, any civilized country should be doing that. No, that's why I'm happy to work with the people in Slovenia. You know, it's an institute of philosophical study. I'm not even a trained philosopher, but they tolerate me. And well, most of them obviously work on the Western tradition, but you know, so many have. I mean, the director has also dabbled in the Upanishads and even translated them from Sanskrit into Slovene. But they employ sinologists, and I mean, even if you don't understand exactly what they're doing, often what they decide to explore often give you, even if it's just the idea of, well, I wonder if that could work for us. Yeah. That is what I consider the fun bit of being a scholar. It's these realizations that you think,
the whole point of collaboration is that you potentially see something from a different perspective, and
not necessarily understand the ins and outs of what they are examining, but it's often working inspirational, isn't it? That you think, well, if it works for the sinologist or the person working on Brazilian syncretic religions, why could we not do that?
Exactly. Because you know, it is classic Orientalism to assume that Islam and Muslims are sui generis, right?
Yes.
So, I think that's a very important.
I mean, if now that you talk about Orientalism, I'm part of the project. I mean, I talk now only about literary writers who happen to be from Muslim backgrounds, time permitting, and maybe I actually will make it the scope that broad. Although I wonder if that would get, indeed, the sufficient support also of funding bodies if I would decide to go and buy some more time or cobble a team together. I also want to look at, you know, literary writers from non-Muslim backgrounds, but who also have the Muslim world as a theme. And there is quite a few who, well, some of them you can accuse of blatant Orientalism, but so be it. Then if this is still alive and kicking, then that is the case. But I've also seen other ways of employing or featuring Islam, Muslims, or even tiny themes taken from that tradition in a way that does not carry that, say, colonial baggage.
Yeah.
And you know, these images complement each other.
Yeah, no, I think there's a lot more out there, and
I have my work cut out for myself for the next 10, 12 years.
I mean, that sounds like a huge project. I mean, you're going to have to really break it down.
No, it is definitely not something. No, it's not something I can do on my own. What I can do on my own is ride my hobby horses and turn some of these writers in pet projects. But it might also inspire other people to select or come up with writers from entirely different countries whom I don't know about simply because I don't know the languages or whatever. And then it might become something more collaborative as well. And I'm also looking, you know, not only at people in religion departments or Middle Eastern departments within King's, you know, there's also a department of comparative literature, and there's some people have dabbled in Islamic related stuff. Right. It's all still very embryonic. The only thing is that I know the writers I'm interested in, but I hope it gets a bit more traction, and a lot of people also would say, like, yeah, I would like to read some fun books as well and have a valid academic excuse to do it.
No, I mean, you've always got to do what you love. I mean, there's no doubt about that.
I think that is
Learning,
important to stay motivated. As I said, I have a limited concentration span, and I find it just as important to educate myself as than to teach, to be honest.
cool. Well, Carool, thank you for this. And
My pleasure. Always
my
nice talking to you, Sajjad.
my main kind of takeaway from this is that
Yeah.
if people have been listening to this carefully, hopefully they will have realized that contemporary Islamic thought can be a lot more than they might have imagined it was. And
I think the sky is the limit.
it's certainly, we need to kind of break some sort of shackles which are very established and how we compartmentalize the way in which we study thought. So I think that's been wonderfully good. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. And thanks for having me.
Thank you. And thank you for those who have been watching this. As I've been mentioning, I will be putting up a recording of this on the Exeter Institute's YouTube channel. And then we, of course, do still have 2 more of these conversations to come still this week. And so keep on the ads for that. So this remains for me to thank Carool once again, and hope to see you in better times and in person.
Yes.
And not necessarily.
It will happen.
But, yeah, this has been wonderfully good. Thank you very much.
Thank you. My pleasure. My pleasure. Take care.
Bye.
Cheers.